Let's go. I'm Justin. I'm a free agent, and my pronouns are he and they.
I'm Sadie. I work IT at a public library, and my pronouns are they, them.
I'm Jay. I'm a cataloging librarian, and my pronouns are he, him.
And we have guests. Would you like to introduce yourselves?
My name is Jason. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm an academic librarian in public services.
I'm Jordan. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm a director of library services.
Thank you. All right. Director of library services, is that like access services, or you're the full director of the whole thing?
Full director, the whole shebang, yeah.
Right. I'm just really keen on job titles right now because I'm doing all this job hunting. So everything comes up and it's like, oh, you're the director / CEO of this job. It's like, okay, well, which is it? Throws me off. Certainly that job did not have a salary commensurate with what I would call a CEO, but we'll see what happens with that one. So I'm interested in learning more about the two of you before we get started. Jason, would you tell me a little bit about yourself and why you decided to be an editor for this book?
Let's see. I'm a small town boy from Alabama that finished his master's in history and knew that I didn't want to go on to get my PhD. So I got kind of pointed in the direction of library school. I really enjoyed the research and the idea of helping others with their research. So I've kind of bounced around few places over the years, landed here about 3 years ago, had a career, active in LGBTQ community, both professionally and personally. Both Jordan and I served together on the board of an equality center. That was some fun times. For me, this book was it was cathartic after several experiences that Jordan and I shared together when we were working together at our previous university, or my previous university. And one thing that kind of I kept with me was the thought that someday this will be useful to you. And then we just kind of reached this moment of critical mass with all the things going on that it seemed like a moment right to come out with a book to kind of talk about the experiences we had. And I'll just kind of stop there and let Jordan kind of catch up. And then we'll talk a little bit more about the origins of the book.
Yeah, I guess my story is kind of similar to Jason's. I've been in libraries since I was 16, so it's been a minute. And honestly, I think part of my reason for being in libraries, it's kind of the common story. I like helping people, etc. But I also, from my youngest years, I've hated censorship. I can't with it. I know that sounds silly, but there's a lot to say. I've edited a book about it. I kind of want to gather my thoughts here, but my interest in fighting censorship didn't directly connect to my interest in libraries and my professional work until, like Jason has just hinted at, we had these, sort of shared professional experiences at Jason's previous job and at my current workplace where censorship did come into play. And then in the last couple of years, moms, I keep doing this Freudian slip, Moms Against Liberty. They'll do the right thing and call it Moms for Liberty. Started doing their thing. And I think that might have been a little bit of the catalyst for our deciding to edit this book, was seeing that, we've had these experiences and it's going on at an institutional level at other places, and let's gather some thoughts around it.
Yeah, we did a whole episode about Moms Against Liberty, and I'm going to take that now because I think it's always good to throw in a nickname once in a while. So it works for the Starvation Army, it'll work for Moms Against Liberty. So I'm going to drill that into my head, and that's what they're called now. But yeah, being from Florida, I was aware of the Florida politics that are running Moms Against Liberty, which is, basically DeSantis screwed up his campaign funds and then had a bunch of money to spread into, astroturfing some stuff. And so we did a real deep dive on them. So I know this is related to Emily Drabinski's book series. So why don't you tell us how the books got started?
So I had a contribution in an earlier book in that series, Out Behind the Desk. So that was kind of that was kind of an end that, let's start here. And so Jordan and our original idea was we wanted to do this book about academic libraries, instances of censorship of LGBTQ materials and services and academic libraries, because there's not a lot of scholarship out there about it. And really, the most thorough treatment of it came from Carmichael's work in the 90s. And there hasn't really been much since then in terms of academic libraries. So that was our initial thought. We did our call for proposals and had just such a tremendous response to that from school librarians, public librarians, archivists, that we decided to expand the scope of the book to just cover libraries in general, because there was so much there that could be said and that needed to be said. Jordan?
I think that's about right. Yeah, we began with this idea that we would be, working in new territory if we were targeting academic libraries specifically. And then it became very clear as we began, doing a lit review and kind of, I think, honestly, as submissions started rolling in response to our initial CFP, that this was going to be a much more comprehensive project that was going to incorporate lots of different kinds of libraries and different kinds of censorship, honestly, because I think one concept that we get at is there are various ways to censor things. So yeah, it was maybe a little bit of mission creep at the outset, but I think that it ended up going in a more thorough direction, I hope.
I think one thing that was important is we wanted to have kind of this toolkit component to each of the chapters. We didn't just want to tell stories. We wanted people to be able to have kind of something to take away from it. Like, how can I use this in my situation? So that's something that I'm hopeful will be helpful in this present moment. Another important thing, and we had to kind of, go separate from some great contributions we got along the way, is that we wanted these chapters to be accessible to as many people as possible. And I think, some of our colleagues, particularly those in academic librarianship, have kind of this academic voice, if you will, when they're writing, that is not very clear or understandable to people that don't read and speak in that academic voice. And so we had some contributions that were just kind of really up there in the ether, and we tried to maybe tone it down a little bit. And ultimately, we just had to kind of part ways. But it was important to us that we wanted this book to be accessible to everyone. And so that's something else that I want to kind of put a plug in for.
And when did the final draft come in? Like, what time of year? Like, when did the book stop updating, basically?
Oh, gosh.
We got the final chapters in December of 23.
23,
Okay.
yeah, and then there was like a full year of like basically like our like final edits to the chapters and back and forth through the publisher before it went to press.
Litwin and Library Juice Press, they were also impacted by Hurricane Helene. I think a lot of their operations are based out of Asheville, North Carolina, so that also kind of slowed down the publication process.
And I'm not actually entirely certain that we have said the name of the book yet so far. No,
We're so good at this.
we're so good at this. So yeah, why don't you give us the bare bones of, the metadata of the book, if you will?
Well, as you can see from
Great
the
cover.
front cover, the title of the book is Censorship is a Drag, LGBTQ Materials and Programming Under Siege in Libraries. And for folks at home that can't see, I'm holding up a copy of the book, and the cover itself has the title, has, Jordan and I as the co-editors, but it's been marked out with a black marker. And that was a very deliberate choice that we and the publisher made as part of this statement.
It reminds me of those banned book socks. Yeah, you can get.
Okay. So since this book kind of wrapped before the election, obviously we're a little behind, and obviously all the chapters are very prescient, but didn't really know like the flooding of issues that we were going to be dealing with on all different sorts of levels. Although most of them guessed pretty correctly, I would say. I think there's I would definitely love to see like a volume 2 where people update, based on what happens during the next year, because a lot's changing very quickly.
It's funny that you point that out. This is a conversation Jordan and I have had together and with our series editor, Emily Drabinski, whom I can't say enough good things about. She's good people. That when we sent the manuscript to the publisher in March of 24, and then kind of through the year, Jordan and I had kind of the feeling that, maybe as a country, maybe we were about to turn a corner on things. Maybe this was just going to be kind of an inflection point. and this would just be kind of a book of history documenting what happened. And sadly, that was not the case.
So, and actually, there's something in, I think it's our introduction chapter, that I wanted to point to. And this is a passage that I think I wrote. While we've seen encouraging signs that the oppressive measures of the past several years are facing real pushback and even exhaustion within the ranks, as one Mom for Liberty noted in early 2024, I guess there wasn't as much willingness to do the work that's required to propel the movement forward. There's no reason this can't happen again. So, I think we're definitely writing kind of under the assumption that, the election wouldn't fix everything. Obviously, elections don't fix everything, but under the idea that maybe, this sort of, Moms for Liberty movement and kind of, the tensions and the pressures that we were discussing in our book had maybe, reached their highest point, and then were beginning to burn themselves out. And then everything else started happening. And we've had the developments, at this whiplash speed just in the past couple of months. So we did definitely kind of go from the sense of the book being not just a historical document, but in part a historical document, to being, I optimistically think, kind of a part of a continuing conversation that we don't want to continue because it means censorship is still ongoing, but it's going on whether we like it or not.
Yeah. It's funny you mention the burnout of these movements. So one thing we actually did when we were talking, would have been 2022, we actually brought on a comedian to talk about sort of right-wing engagement on the internet. So when we were seeing this sort of rise in book bans, we were also seeing the forces behind it were people like Chris Rufo and these online right-wing influencers. And right at that time, the war in Ukraine broke out. And of course, that changed everyone's talking points immediately. And so one thing that we were talking about was, who is going to continue doing the day-to-day work of this? Because you can have rabble-rousers who are big people like libs of TikTok or whatever, but you still have to have the people who are going to write in the complaint forums. There's that guy in Florida who sent out 5,000 across the country by himself. We still are going to have that. Who's going to, the Baptist churches or particularly Southern Baptist? I'm not trying to paint all Baptists with the same brush, but what I said at the time is white citizens councils didn't go away. They moved into the Southern Baptist churches. It's the same people. It's the same political group. That's why they're like that. And so I'm really interested in sort of how it's regained traction through the election of Trump. And it's kind of amazing to me how much the momentum hasn't stalled on attacks on libraries, because you really think, oh, this is the flavor of the week. They'll move on to the next target, but they're really impressively hitting on every target and keeping up the momentum just through the sheer force of maintaining, let's see how long it lasts. It's only the first few months, but they are really keeping their targets in sights, and it's unfortunate.
We started out the book with a chapter on stochastic terrorism written by Bryn Nilsson. And man, that chapter, I went back and reread it again today, and it just really knocks it out of the park. Just kind of setting up this intellectual framework of how and why this is going on, kind of this three-legged stool of having the pundit, having the medium, in this case being the internet, and then having the activity. And it just, it feels like the internet, for all it's good, has unleashed kind of these forces that allow that fire to continue to burn.
Yeah. Even then, without it's really kind of interesting how Moms Against Liberty is still doing the day-to-day work. I really thought this is just going to go to the Facebook grandmas and they'll be the ones writing the letters and stuff, but it's not going to be, essentially an extension of the Ron DeSantis campaign. But that's not true. It's kept up, and that's really not something I expected.
Yeah, and even beyond just censorship of queer materials, with the rise of the sort of on campus protests and encampments against the genocide in Palestine, you're seeing now library administrators censoring their employees. Recently there was a Harvard employee fired for tearing down one of those free the hostage posters, and he was wearing his badge at the time, and so that's how they knew it was him, and they fired him. He was a cataloging librarian at Harvard. That one of the heads of, or whoever's high, their university librarian or whatever, also was banning library employees from entering the building when they were supporting students and faculty's silent like protests in the library. So it's even beyond just the materials now. It's like any sort of dissentive speech if the library doesn't agree with it, because apparently that's not what libraries are for now. That's news to me. But so it's even just beyond materials, like employees are being censored or just straight up fired now.
So honestly, like that connect. I mean, there's an experience that I think it's Jason to tell, but that we recount in the book about. I mean, Jason, the incident.
Which one?
Yeah, which one?
Relatable.
So a good librarian does not, you know.
Oh dear God. Yeah. So that anecdote that's really kind of at the root of this book.
Yeah.
Is that inspired this book. These things will be useful for you later. To just briefly summarize, we had a new librarian start, I guess in like 2015, who wanted to start doing a banned books display. And so I did a search in our catalog, and to say the collection wasn't great because we had just transitioned not long before from a community college to a four-year university, and had largely relied on donations from the state library or from the community. So the collection wasn't great. So of course we don't have a lot of the banned books. So I used some retrospective collection development funds from a project I got approval for to purchase every title available on Amazon, because that was the book jobber we were using at the time, all the banned books from the banned books list, including The Joy of Gay Sex, which became kind of the cause of great furor in the library for several years. One of the library employees objected to adding the book to the collection, brought the book to a meeting, and we went through this whole rigmarole of, explaining why this book is being added. We got faculty to weigh in on the value of this book in our collection, and the staff member just continued to refuse to accept it. And one day, in a moment of frustration, the library director at the time, not Jordan's wonderful, but the library director at the time came into my office and just simply said that a good librarian does not do anything to jeopardize their library or the place of their paycheck. I kind of took that as a veiled threat, and that was kind of the seed for that particular chapter.
Academic libraries have so much porn in them, though. Like, have they not heard of like a women's studies department? Like, of the libraries that have porn, it's usually academic libraries. Like, this is not new. This is not controversial. Like,
and what's really
we
funny
even had
is
The Joy of Sex in the collection.
Yeah.
Of course.
And like I'm a movie guy, and I donate like old DVDs of mine to the library that have absolutely filthy stuff in them, and the staff member never objected to that stuff because apparently she wasn't watching the movies, but she was able to go through this one-off book and find it has graphic illustrations, but they're nothing more graphic than you would find in the heterosexual counterpart to the book.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's an acknowledged classic. Whether she likes it or not, it's a classic. So, but beyond that,
and you had ordered a book that she added to the collection without question, Tulsa.
I ordered, Tulsa by Larry Clark, and I'm sorry, that book is every bit as graphic as anything in the Edmund White book. But maybe she liked me better. I don't know.
I have what I like to call a resting bear face. That has won me few friends over the years.
Well, it depends where you are at the time. But Sadie just shot me such a look. I've lost my. Oh, but I remember in the story, you were. I believe it was you, Jason, who was ordering books, and the person was not ordering them.
Yeah, we talk about that in our building collection development policy chapter. So as I mentioned, we were using Amazon as our jobber. So what we would do is we would send Amazon links to a librarian in the library who was responsible for actually purchasing them and doing all the technical processing to add them to the collection. So I faithfully sent, I think one year, let me back up. We were doing this retrospective collection development project I got approval for. So each year I would pick an underserved community to buy books for. So one year African Americans, one year Native Americans, and so on. And so the year came around. I didn't start out with the gays because that would just be a little too on the nose. But one year I ordered or requested a whole slew of titles from the Stonewall Book Awards and the Lambda Awards. So award-winning titles. and sent them faithfully on, thinking that these books were being ordered for the collection. And it was only later, when we were putting together a book display for Pride Month, that I realized that actually, no, the books were never ordered.
And this was the single person just sort of vetoing it on their own, with and sometimes going to the director to veto.
Yeah, I think, and this was kind of before the whole rigmarole about the joy of gay sex, because again, I bought that for that Banned Books Week project. But I don't know if it was the director that tacitly said no, or if it was just this librarian exercising their prerogative. But in either case, the books were not ordered.
And something that I really like, how the stochastic terrorism and stochastic actions chapter is so high up in the book, early in the book, because I think it pulls together a lot of the chapters by explaining how this whole thing is connected. So the weaponization of essentially disgust and saying this is not suitable for the library ties into social media moderation changes. So we all know, have friends who are sex workers who get stuff censored or who get kicked off platforms, or people who write smut or anything like that getting tagged in ways that a straight author wouldn't be. And tying this into the anti-school movement, the anti-library movement, the anti-college movement, the anti-grants movement, the whole DEI thing, and also the enforcement. So the enforcement of, these laws are really important. So the TSA people who are deciding to exercise their prerogative to harass trans people more or harass brown people more, all of it is kind of coming from the same well, and it really lets you see all of the aspects through all the different chapters where where people are talking about different things, talking about internal censorship, talking about any particular thing that came up that was mentioned in this book, like Stop Woke or government info or drag story events. That's all coming from kind of the same place, which is giving everyone the opportunity to be nasty to queer people.
And there's also, I think, a component where people are almost forced to internalize this stuff. So it goes back to the idea of community standards, right? If you're working within these sort of widely accepted, or what somebody says is widely accepted parameters, community standards, eventually you're going to internalize that as part of your practice. And that is, it's almost like this panopticon thing where you end up, with this perception that, this some force outside of me is going to attack me if I don't adhere to this. And so you don't end up taking these risks, right? Jason, did you, after these events happened, did you get more, outgoing with your LGBTQ oriented purchasing, or did you kind of keep your head down,
I absolutely did not.
Okay.
I remember when I was heading out the door, I was really tempted to buy another copy of The Joy of Gay Sex because the copy that we bought just disappeared.
Of course.
It was never
Someone was
added
having
to
a
the
lot of
collection.
fun.
Yeah. As an aside, the employee that challenged adding that book allegedly was not homophobic because they have a gay cousin that they're very fond of.
Of course.
So maybe they gave it to their cousin.
I think they're the gay cousin.
So it has had a chilling effect for sure. When I left the job, I moved on. I was content to stay there for the rest of my career. I still miss that community. I had a community of scholars that we have a group chat that is active every single day. I miss working with those people, but I left, and I talk about this in one of our other book chapters. Look at the title list. Or no, I've got it in our little sheet here.
Is it At What Cost?
Yes, At What Cost? I
just
talk
read that
about
one.
this, with queer battle fatigue. That's the result of, not even just being an advocate, being a gay person in a situation where you're being asked to explain something, being asked to defend something, it takes a toll. But when you are an advocate, buying books, doing programming, and you experience this backlash, it takes a professional and personal toll. For 3 years, I had to go on anti-anxiety medications because of everything, just the culmination of it all. And this was even before the pandemic. So it it takes a toll, and I've kind of recalibrated my scholarship, my service since then. I reached out to, well, when we had it here in Florida, reached out to the sponsor. Oh gosh, the safe zone training on campus, because I used to be a safe zone trainer, and I was interested in doing that here, and kind of getting involved. But I said, I do not want to be the face person. I'm happy to work behind the scenes. I don't want to be the face person. I had these bad experiences before, and I'm happy to be a worker bee, but please don't put me out front.
Yeah. Jordan, you mentioned community standards, and I wanted to talk about the chapter Building and Defending LGBTQ plus collections, because I guess we already have talked about it a little bit, which is the titles had not been ordered at all. But was there more about community standards you wanted to say in terms of this anti-queer movement?
I think I guess for one thing, it kind of brings us to this sinister incident of the drag story time that we had, where I think community standards also came into play as a concept. So basically, I want to say that it was the end of 2018. We had the idea that we should do a drag story time in our academic library, that this would be a fun kind of offbeat event for finals. It would be a stress buster, and it would be definitely a way of getting attention. It drew the wrong kind of attention. It got the attention of a state legislature who effectively said, I think, these are not the kinds of events that we should be supporting, certainly not with taxpayer money. So, and really, Jason, and this is more straight for you, because I think you ended up kind of taking the administrative brunt of this, didn't you?
And I wasn't even the one that initially organized the event.
Mm-hmm.
Wasn't even my idea or on my radar, but I was the sponsor of the student group Pride at UAFS at the time. So, we had the idea of, hey, let's get the student group to sponsor this, and we'll just house it in the library. And that kind of put me front and center. I remember there was, everything was fine. Our library director at the time had gotten approval from her immediate supervisor. Everything seemed fine. And then, when the state legislator, who ironically or not so ironically is now on the state library board, got wind of it, and all these things started blowing up. And then, the university was getting pressure from the local community and from alumni. At that point, things started to hit the fan. And I had both the provost and the associate provost come over to my office. I had never seen either of them in the library before, much less in my office. And that was really kind of daunting to have both of them sit down and, go over the particulars of this event with me. And we talk about this in some detail, particularly in our toolkit of, if you're going to do it, this is how you should do it. And part of the issue is that we had included the library's logo on the flyer. And so, the legislator had really latched onto that and said that the university was endorsing this event because the library logo was on the flyer. And so ultimately, the decision was made to just take the logo off the flyer and everything would go forward. But it was a real stressful time.
But I also think, going back to the idea of community standards, that was sort of like the cliche that came into play a little bit. And I don't remember whether that phrase was actually articulated in the whole thing. Certainly the concept was, but it wasn't the community getting upset. It was one or two people in the community maybe getting, a few of their online followers stirred up about the whole thing. But the community's reaction really, it seemed positive to me. People did not seem to take the event. It wasn't like small town rises up to oppress, the gays within. It was really, this agreeable event is happening. People who want to show up are going to show up. Those who don't will avoid it. But it ended up, I think the opposition kind of painted themselves as being, the voice of the community in this whole thing. And I think that's what happens a lot of the time with community standards. Somebody who's vehemently against something will represent themselves as being, the authority on it. They are the ones who speak for the community, whereas the gays or the minorities, whatever, are not, by dint of being minorities, they cannot speak for the community. That's the dynamic that I think was in play in this event. And I think that's the dynamic that's in play so much in so many of these situations where the community, really a minority within the community, is there to oppress materials, programming, whatever.
It ended up being a really lovely event, and a news crew had come to film it. And they actually packed up and left early because it was so anticlimactic, in the height of all the drama that had led up to it. I mean, with all the drama, you would have thought a drag queen was planning it, but
and I think a mistake that people make when these kinds of things happen is to actually take the argument as valid. oh, how dare they have a drag queen around the children? Why do the drag queens only go to the children and not the like elderly and stuff? It's because they're all pedophiles. And we go, no, we're not. And it's like, that's actually not the way that you tackle this, because then you're like giving their argument any validity at all. And that's just
Yep.
not what we should be doing by like having this like, oh, we're squeaky clean, like sexless figures, like we're okay to be in your community. It's like, no, like, well, that's bullshit.
Something kind of similar happened at one of my former library systems where they organized a drag story hour for the first time. And the area was very, very rural, but surprisingly democratic in the places where there were actually people. And the library that was holding the event was the biggest city in the area. And they kind of did that where people were all up on the Facebook being like, well, blah, blah, blah. Why is this pervert reading to our children, et cetera, et cetera. And for some reason, the idea that somebody got was to go, okay, but she's a local school teacher. To be like, this is something that, she's, this is just something she does on this, but this is like, she has the qualifications to be doing this just as well as one of our like children's librarians kind of thing. What's the thought process? But then as soon as they were like, well, no, she's a local school teacher, like nothing about this is going to be inappropriate. The first thing that got asked was, what school does she teach at?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Which then just escalates it immediately.
Why is she a school teacher? It's because she wants to be around the children. Like,
and at that point, the PR fucking shut down. Like, they thankfully just shut down that line of questioning whatsoever, and we're just like, we're not talking, we're not answering any more questions about this. We are going ahead with the event as scheduled. Not answering any more questions about this. If you want to come. If you don't, and it went off without a hitch because it was like 3 people, right? Who probably didn't even live in that part of the county. They probably lived like an hour and a half away or whatever. But like that, I cannot imagine being that person being like, I'm going to spend my time doing this thing for my community and representing my community only to have to be like, well, where is your job at? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's fucking terrifying.
Mm-hmm.
Even if ultimately the event goes perfectly smoothly, like you said, Jason, it's queer battle fatigue. That's probably the best like way that's such a good term for it. But yeah, the don't pretend like their arguments are valid is really the thing. And yeah.
What y'all are circling around, it's perfect because, just don't accept the premise.
Yep.
And unfortunately, the university being a public institution, they had to accept the premise because one of the people throwing dust up in the air about it in the legislature was chair of the committee responsible for the university's state funding. But, to their credit, and I really, if anyone from there hears this podcast, I do want to give credit. They did continue with the event. We did get asked a ton of questions afterwards. How is this event funded? Was any public funds used for the event? Thank God none were, or I'm sure someone would have gotten fired. So all of it had either come from the local nonprofit, Equality Center, or from the student group.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's on the topic of community standards. I think there's another way we can approach it, which is when someone is saying that they speak for the community. I think also a lot of people, particularly like liberal-minded people, think less of their community. And so they're like, well, of course they're all against queer people. But you shouldn't think that in yourself either. I think you should kind of assume the best. These are just, really loud, annoying people. It puts people on the defensive. And one thing I was thinking of was years ago, there was this event at the Alabama, I think, archive. Is Alabama or Georgia? And there was an event about queer life in Alabama. And one of the legislators said, well, this doesn't represent Alabamans. And it's like, it's about Alabamans who are queer in Alabama. Like, it's about them. You can't.
How could it get more about Alabamans, right?
Yeah. And so exactly saying like, we're having a drag story hour in our community with community people who want to go and people who want to do the story time. So, you can really, I think, circumvent a lot of the argument by saying this is all run locally. This is your community.
Mm-hmm. And we touch on that and the collection development chapter because, like you were saying, this university is located in kind of a rural area. It's the biggest town in that part of the state. And so, the library is the only place that some of these people are going to find these books. The only place they're going to see themselves represented. Otherwise, we had, I think, one gay bar in town, and that was it. We had our, quality center. We were small but mighty. And so it's so important to have these materials, to have these programming, because we're part of the community. When community standards, we're part of the community. That's why we also were collecting materials about the Hispanic community, because that part of Arkansas has a huge Hispanic population. That's why we got books about the Native American community, because we're next door to the Choctaw Reservation. And I think that needs to be the angle that we push back with, is that if you want to talk about community standards, we are part of the community.
Yeah. I think people are hesitant to believe that because they want to believe, their child won't be gay or their cousin won't be gay. And I think that's why a lot of this centers around parents and children, because there's this sort of fear that a lot of people have, that their children are going to go off and do something that they don't quite understand, but that their first tentative ways of understanding themselves is going to be at the public library or in public school, or once they get to university. I mean, sometimes it takes time because, again, your experience is so curtailed as a child. Like when we talked about the rights of children to read and know things, you can say there's like, this is a extreme minority in our community, but you don't know.
Yeah.
Even if there's only one person, that person exists.
Mm.
Like during our time in this area where I'm still there, and Jason has since left, but we'd known multiple people who, like married a woman young and then came out later in life. Like that's a story that is common here because people don't have access to this crucial aspect of their identities. And I'm not going to say that having these materials in libraries that represent the entire community would necessarily be the cure-all for that, but it wouldn't be a problem. It would help at the very least,
Oh yeah. Yeah, we've done tons of episodes where we've said, how did you find information about being queer? And it's like, the internet really helped. And also I just saw a book at the library. You'd be surprised how often the library comes up. Of just like
that was the case for me when I was kind of coming of age, finding a book in the library. And that, like, I still remember that moment, like a light came on and I realized that I'm not a freak, that there's not something wrong with me. And I don't think the people screaming about community standards appreciate that, how lonely and scary it can be to grow up as a queer person, or at least, when I was growing up.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe they do to some degree. Oh, go on.
Yeah. And why it takes them having like a gay child to finally go, I get it, because they love their child, but they can't imagine beforehand what that reality would actually feel like.
It can also be important to be a little bit, I don't know if prefigurative is the right word, but like even if you don't know if there are queer people in your community, which there are, but even if say there weren't, is it so horrible to have books about queer people in your collection, even if they're not, quote, in your community? Like the books, what's in a library and who's in a community doesn't have to map like one-to-one. Like there might one day be queer people. People might want to learn about queer people. Like queer people are just cool and we should know about them. I don't know. Like this whole thing that like a library's collections have to perfectly map onto the community members, I think sometimes gets us into problems like this.
Mm.
And that's kind of what collection development is about, right? It's about foreseeing the needs of your community before they're explicitly articulated to you.
Right.
That's a good job of collection development.
Yeah, and it's why it starts at the school libraries, because that has I'm missing the word, but that you have, when you learn things in public school, you are forced to learn them and forced to learn about them. In a public library, you're sort of free to learn about it. There's a coercion aspect to public schools. But once you talk about like a public library or a university, that kind of coercive aspect isn't as important. Although, people try and say like, well, you're forcing people to learn about gay stuff in university. It's like, well, yeah, but you went to university. What do you want? You're going to have to learn about the world. So yeah, I think there's that. That's why it starts and goes in the order that it does in communities, starting with school libraries and then saying like, you're forcing our children to read these things, when everyone knows it's just the unforced force of being interested in something or a better argument. When you're talking about queer battle fatigue, I also wanted to talk about like creating division. Why are you creating division in your community when you talk about racism, when you talk about genocide, when you talk about queer people? And it's because, we have to understand that we're not the ones creating division. We are the focal point of it, though, because we bring attention to it. But we're not starting these things. And I think maybe people can feel a little, I don't know if it will help with the battle fatigue, but realizing that you are going to be seen as the conflict itself rather than a person who's just trying to explain the conflict to other people.
Sara Ahmed writes about this phenomenon a lot, especially around being a killjoy, like a feminist killjoy, or being a troublemaker because she's the one who would bring up issues around racism or sexual assault in faculty settings and stuff, and that there's a quality to complaining that is sticky, right? It sticks to the person who's doing it, and then they're seen as the source of the problem. She writes about this a lot. I highly recommend her work. Yeah, if folks are interested in this kind of phenomenon of why am I seen as the problem when I'm just pointing out the problem? It's because complaining has this sticky quality to it.
It's funny you
Sara
mentioned
Ahmed's
that
good.
because I'm reaching for a pen and pad to write that down. That happened. And I touch on it in that Queer Battle Fatigue chapter, that as the sponsor of the Pride at UAFS group, the students came to me with a question about gender neutral bathrooms. And so I, wearing my hat as the faculty sponsor, I went to a senior administrator with the question of, do we have gender neutral restrooms on this campus? And what is our policy about gender neutral restrooms? And I never got a reply from him. So, I was diligent and, followed up 3 times. And he finally just said, tell the students to use the bathroom that they're most comfortable using. But at his next staff meeting, he said, Jason Phillips is a troublemaker.
Yeah.
And I wasn't trying to stir up the issue. And that was actually an issue that had created some national attention for the university a few years before about the question of, accommodating a trans student. So I wasn't even stirring up trouble. I just was asking a question. What is our policy? But asking the question meant I was a troublemaker.
It means you're the source of the problem because people didn't know there was a problem until you brought it up.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. I also, to remind everyone, I do try and make a list of everything that we mention in an episode. So when I go back and edit, so I'll have the links to Sara Ahmed's books and The Joy of Gay Sex and everything else we mentioned. So those will all be linked in the notes.
If you're a librarian, buy them for your collection.
Exactly.
Buy 3 copies of The Joy of Gay Sex so everyone knows how good it is.
Mm-hmm.
And also buy several copies of Censorship as a Drag.
Yes, that too. Wink.
The Library Punk recommended reading list for your library.
And remember, you are also a patron of your library. Even if you don't do collection development, you are also a patron and you can request things.
Yeah.
But to be honest, I have not bought a copy of our book for our library yet. And here's why. Honestly, I'm still working at the place where these experiences happened. And I think the atmosphere is distinctly more sympathetic. It's distinctly more sympathetic to diversity now. But I'm still mindful that I'm working in the South. And that is a region that it still has all these tensions, these pressures, these increasing, aggressions toward LGBTQ people. And I have administrative support in this thing. Our chancellor bought a copy and brought it to me to sign it, and I was touched by that. But at the same time, I'm like, do I want to put a target on my back if I don't necessarily have to in this case? And it hurts me not to have a copy of my own book in the library where I work, but also I'm like, maybe this is best for now. Maybe the situation will feel different in a few years and I'll finally, steel my nerve and do it. But up to this point, I haven't felt comfortable with it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Picking your fights is important.
Mm-hmm.
It really is. I've always talked about that. I mean, on the whole range of issues of being a worker in a library, labor issues. I quit my job recently and that was just a line I had to draw of this is it. This is where I'm gone. But, things like that. I'm also in the South. So, we had a DEI collection in our repository, which I was the supervisor of. And one of the other librarians who is an ally, quote unquote, was like, we got to take that out because we don't want, because people have seen the IT searches through the entire web domain for the word gay or DEI and whatever. And it's not even that bad in Texas in terms of that kind of thing happening. which is a strange sentence to say. But it's true. Like, no one has come around with a list of like, here's every time your website says gay or LGBTQ. That hasn't happened. And so it was very, it was very much like, you can pin this on me if you want to, but it was also, as I was thinking of it, because this happened months and months ago. But as I was thinking of it, I was like, I don't know, maybe they were right. Maybe that was just too easy of a target. And, it wasn't good for the people whose works were in there. So maybe, but it still made me feel bad. And it also still was like, hey, I'll take the hit. I'll be the face of this because it's fine. But that's a line I'm willing to draw. But it's it's also because like I'm willing to move. I'm willing to get a new job. That's not everyone's position. One of the this is good. One of the things that comes up multiple times in the book is the political nature of libraries requires an organized response. Not just, we've talked a lot about our individual stuff, but, an organized response from librarians, from library unions, from library workers, from the ALA, from our professional organizations that we're in, that there must be an organized response because our individual responses are one, too taxing on us and create too specific of a target, as we've seen with mass firings, things like that. Because it's an organized attack on queer existence itself. And I think taking it on as a big thing of saying the ALA is against this because this is an attack on all queer people existing. It's not a library specific issue, but we're going to talk about it from the library perspective. But we're talking about this sort of the fear, the failure of neutrality as a policy, which was never really a policy. In fact, it doesn't really come up anywhere in most libraries' codes of conduct or anything. And it made me think. There was a discussion recently in the Skullcom Shit Talk Discord about what happened at Spark, which is they removed a lot of language around DEI and queerness and things like that from their website because they work directly with the federal government to get grants. And we were going back and forth about, is this a sound move? Is this too much preemptive compliance? Is this a good strategy? And I think most people actually lean towards saying, yeah, it was a good strategy because of the direct nature of their work with the federal government at this moment. It was a good retreat. But it's the same thing with that DEI collection. I don't know how I feel about like that. Like, I think that might be a line for me. But I don't know. What does everyone else think about like strategic retreats, I guess? I know it's a difficult one.
It's funny you mention that. I'm on a ALA committee, and the chair of the committee is a librarian with the federal government. And they recently said that their term is up in June and they are not staying on the committee. And I don't think they're staying involved or active with ALA. And I think that largely has to do with what's going on. And that is kind of a strategic retreat for her in this situation. And I feel badly, but it's tough. It's really tough because we talk about in one of our chapters, if we had to do the drag story time again, would we have done it? And no, I would not have after having lived through that. And that's the line that we have to kind of draw is that, we are professionals, but yeah, I got to keep a roof over my head for my 4 cats and 2 dogs. They're bums and they depend on me. So I understand some of these decisions that they got to keep the lights on. They got to keep the grants rolling in, or they got to do this. But it's a scary time because what's going to get lost in this process? And, assuming, God willing, 4 years from now, we inaugurate someone new and different and better. Are we going to be able to kind of wind back the clock on this, or how much of it's going to be sticking around with us for a while?
Yeah, and I think that's my primary fear.
And these are things that, we thought it was on the wane. We thought it was going away, but it's not, and like one thing that came up recently is we were doing these like kind of like book talks on YouTube for our press. And somebody asked the question in the chat about how does this stuff, sort of echo or rhyme with the NEA censorship of the 80s and 90s, works of art being censored, the government is funding, works by, Andre Serrano or whatever, and we can't allow that to happen. It's the same conversation again. So even if, we get somebody better in office who, maybe doesn't actively hate libraries and gay people, that's not to say that, this sort of tensions driving moms against liberty and similar things are going to fade. I'm afraid these are battles we're going to have to fight again and again, and it sucks. But each time we're going to have to choose our role within the battle.
There are conservative politicians going to use the IMLS like they used to use the NEA.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean,
it's
look at
like,
what's. Oh, go on.
oh no, go ahead, Jordan.
So, like, look at what's happening now with the ALA, where it's literally being weaponized against entire like state libraries because of one remark that the former president of the ALA made. The ALA before this was, I think, it was widely seen as like this unimpeachable organization. It's the ALA. How could we possibly think anything bad of it? But now it's being weaponized against states. Like if a state library association mentions a connection to the ALA, like there's legislation to defund that. That's happening. What was it, Montana? It's happening in Arkansas. These former authorities are no longer really, whether or not they're, fighting on behalf of librarians, they're not leveraged in the same way that they were before. Like the authorities themselves are under attack.
And like with the sort of like being, where do you draw the line between like what's being strategic versus what's bending the knee, or where do we make these decisions and how and why? It's sort of like, does taking language off a website mean you can't do the work anymore? Is sort of where I would like, if me taking a word off of a website means that I don't have the fuzz on my tail, but I still do the work. Like it's more about like be like people who need to know can know. I know there's like, this feels like maybe like related to like discussions of the closet, right? And like visibility and representation. Like this happens with trans people a lot. Like what is representation versus what's putting a target on us? Like there's a reason why trans women are so visible and so attacked. It's because they're so visible, right? Like there's a lot to do with like the politics of the closet and of representation, and people being like, no, I have to be visible. And I'm like, I am visible to the people who matter to me and everything. And it's like, and I'm not saying like we should all go back in the closet, because fuck no, we shouldn't. We should do sodomy in their faces. But like, if I can take a word off a website and that's going to keep me my job, like I'll take a word off a website, like that's where I would draw that line. But being organized is what's important here, is what's very important. Yes, Sadie.
Yeah, well, and I also just kind of think of it as like, again, like individual lines. What's the line for me gonna be? But also like, what hits am I willing to take so other people don't have to take them? Like, like in the past couple of months, I've been thinking really like, everybody's talking about moving to Canada and all of this shit, right? Which has been a very difficult topic, but I have 3 trans nibblings who are teenagers living through this time. And I'm thinking, if I stay and fight, even if they somehow go to a supposedly better country, I'm fighting so they can come back, right? For their future. So I'm willing to take those hits. I'm willing to be the visible queer that I am, so they could possibly be safer in the future, kind of thing. And like that can also apply to our jobs and our communities. Like maybe you keep your head down at your job because you need to keep your job and you're not going to push the envelope there. But maybe outside of your job, you volunteer helping with like immigrants find legal help and teaching, learning Spanish so you can help your neighbors stay away from ICE. So it's like, it's not that zero-sum game, but we all do have to play it individually. But we also have to know which part of our communities we can take the best hit for and which ones are too personal for us to withstand, if that makes sense at all.
Also, unionize.
Like seriously, like I feel like a lot of that is
too.
Like so much of it right now is like voting rights and unionize. Work on voting rights and unionize. Maybe then like, anyways, that's devolving, but that's kind of where I'm at this point.
That Jordan and I were involved with. And I want to say this about Arkansas. When I moved to Arkansas in 2013, it's a conservative state. There's a lot of religious conservatives there. But there was also kind of this really broad streak of libertarianism where I never felt uncomfortable being openly gay in Arkansas, because people were very live and let live there for a time. And so when we would do interviews with the press, we would always say the most important thing that we can do for our community is to be out and open to show people in the closet that it's okay.
Yeah.
So even if that's what it takes doing, is just being out and open and just finding small ways to help the community, that will still be enough for our brothers and sisters that are in the closet or that are running scared.
Yeah, I was always very even early in my transition, when I would do instruction, I was very open about the fact that I was queer, because I my first job at a library school, I lived in Utah, and I wanted the people who, because contrary to popular belief, less than half of the people in Salt Lake City are practicing Mormons, and the Mormons I did meet there were kind of cool. I went on a date with a socialist Mormon one time. That was kind of fun. They're
Mormons
there,
can
I
be
promise.
absolutely wild.
You're fucking wild.
Mormon cat
But
boy.
but I was always very open about the fact that I was queer and that I was trans, because I knew that there were probably kids there who weren't exposed to that when they were younger, and I wanted to show them that it was okay, and also to challenge them, because sometimes you would run into people who needed to be challenged, but that's why they were there and not at Brigham Young University, so that they could be challenged. So
Yeah.
full shade on Brigham Young, but
Yeah, of course. The one thing that I worry about because a website is just a poster board that is the outside face of your organization. It doesn't say, I would prefer Spark exist than not take down some language on their website. The thing is, it feels like I think we might sometimes overestimate how clever we are in terms of, well, we'll back down here, but that means they won't target us. And then you get targeted anyway. And every time you see something on social media where they're like, oh, they backed down on this, but it was strategic, don't you know? It's the Kremlinology of the Democratic Party. It's like, no, they still got played. They still, they know that these organizations are their enemies. They know that the ALA is ultimately not on their side. So it doesn't really matter if the ALA takes a stand or not. So there's definitely times when we have to pick our organizations to be actually saying the things that they need to say, because you need something to rally around.
Yeah. The homosaurus ain't changing shit, for the record.
That'd be very funny to try an anti-queer the homosaurus.
You just take it down at that point.
And there's several references to that source in our book too.
Hell yeah.
Yeah. Jay is our local homosaurus board member.
We're turning into a collective, and you can apply to be on one of the several little committees. And if you're so interested in being involved, Bree Watson put a bunch of links to things in various listservs. Cough. Help us. We're only 6. Give us your free labor.
I got my start in librarianship as a copy cataloger, so I may have
Hell yeah. Let's fucking go.
Yeah, we talked with the Queer Liberation Library folks. They're all moonlighting on that whole project, and they have no institutional support. It's all local funding and funding from the queer community. And that was the other thought I had is, I know people who work on various grant-funded library progressive organizations who have had to, very quickly rewrite their stuff in order to get the next round of grant funding. But how long can we rely on that? Do we need to start looking at other forms of funding, union funds or crowdfunding or things outside of the government? Because right now the government's not a reliable funder.
Can I just say that drag queens are really great fundraisers?
Mm-hmm. Hell yes, they are.
That's another lesson Jordan and I took from the Equality Center, is we used to host an annual gala featuring at least 5 or 6 drag queens, and that was such a bomb fundraiser.
Everyone loves a lady who's very pretty but looks a little bit like a Venus flytrap being a little bit mean to them. That's a universal, the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. That's the bottom one is a lady being mean to me, and she looks like a monster a little bit.
A little bit of a predator.
Yeah. So, pro tip.
And
maybe
then
maybe not that word. Yeah.
Yeah. And also local funding sources, public libraries are funded locally, making sure you have your community on your side. And I know it's a difficult tightrope, but it's important.
I think too,
even if you're union, the support of your community members is what gives you as a union power. You can't go on a quote, one, there's no such thing as an illegal strike. The only illegal strike is a failed strike. Remember that, kids. But if you go on a strike, even if you're not allowed to, cough, the way you do that is by having community support so that you don't piss them off by being a public servant who is now on strike, right? And you show them how it's inconvenience, but they're like, yeah, it is inconvenient. And they're mad at the right people and not you.
Right.
And I think that's something that we kind of harp on in one of our chapters where we talk about, is it Building and Defending, Jason? Where we talk about how you have to have an investment in your community before anything goes wrong. I mean, obviously,
Yes.
Obviously, there are situations where that won't necessarily help because obviously there are plenty of libraries who, think they have community support and then surprise, the rug's pulled out from under them by, some cranks or whatever. But if you have a foothold in your community, people really recognize the value of your resources, that will at least give you people beyond your staff who will fight for you if the shit hits the fan. Like, you don't want to be left alone fending for yourself in these situations. You want to have people writing letters on your behalf and making noise to the state legislature. Well, Jason, you have an example close to home about this, don't you, from Alabama, just the past couple of days?
Yes, I was going to mention that. To Jordan's point, though, real quick, we talk about that. He actually wrote that part of that chapter talking about how librarians and libraries were not really built or poised to sort of defend ourselves because it's not our mindset. And so that's why it's really essential to develop these communities of support and allies. And in the academic setting, that's your faculty and your faculty senate. What Jordan mentioned, though, is, and this kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, how things are different in 2025 from when we started out with this in 2022, is the bans and the protest has become more institutionalized. They're taking over school boards, they're taking over library boards, they're taking over the state library board, which happened in Alabama. Chair of the library board in Alabama is also the Republican Party leader of Alabama. They just fired the state director of libraries because there were libraries that were getting funded from the state library that had these banned books in their collections. The notable example being Fairhope Public Library, which Fairhope is neighbor of the small town I grew up in Daphne. And the community has rallied around this public library. They had a city council meeting where basically one of the city councilmen gave a full-throated defense of the public library and said, we don't need outsiders telling us how to run our library. And that has been so effective in the defense of this library. And the amount of money they're getting from the state that's been suspended is kind of minimal from what they're getting locally. But I think that's kind of the thing, is like rallying that community support, that we don't need outsiders telling us what to do. And the people protesting and challenging these books aren't even members of our community. And I think really kind of rallying around that kind of particular perspective could be effective.
So there was an issue that me and Jay were talking about, and I think this would be the best time to pull it into the podcast, which is the discussions about the Library of Congress subject headings and the difference between that and local cataloging. So there are changes happening at LCSH, which, is the Library of Congress. It is not our national library, but we rely on it a lot. And a lot of people are saying, hey, you can do local cataloging. You can use local subject headings. You can use home source in order to make sure that things are still discoverable. But
especially with the Gulf of Mexico to Gulf of America and Denali back to Mount McKinley is the main two things that happened recently.
Yeah, but there's labor issues. Jay, why don't you go ahead and say what you were thinking?
So, yes, it is absolutely true. You do not have to go into your catalog and change all of these over. I saw a lot of people going you're complying in advance if you don't do anything. And to that, I say, do you actually know what doing authority work in a catalog is like, especially at scale? And also, do you know all of the are you not using OCLC records? Because OCLC will change them over and other people will add them in. Are you going to always change them when they come over? Do you have an automatic process? Do you pay a third-party vendor to do this for you? Are you in an academic library and so you don't think about these things? Do you have electronic resources like ebooks and stuff that come in through a discovery layer where the MARC record never even touches your catalog? These headings are going to get into your catalog whether you like it or not, which sucks. This is bad and I hate it. And it's bad that we rely on LC so much, including internationally. like LC stuff affects cataloging at an international scale, right? And so when the people were like, well, if you don't use local headings, if you just sit back and do nothing, you're complying in advance. And like, who's doing their authority control? And so like these questions of like labor around censorship and around like stuff this particular regime is trying to impede upon libraries, like there's only so much you can do as an individual. And this is why organizing and stuff is so important, because it's like if libraries won't even pay for us to do the authority control, if they want to shill out a third party to do it, like they're not going to fund just doing, okay, well, Denali is now Mount McKinley, so we want to make sure it's not Denali again. To which I want to say, why aren't you doing that for every single place name in your catalog that has an Indigenous counterpart to it? Why don't you work with your local tribal communities to see what language they might actually want changed?
Mhm.
And it's because of money. We don't have the money to do that because that's like a project and it's not necessarily sustainable unless you have money like in a budget line for it. And so like I guess with like some of these issues around like complying in advance, and there's only so much you can quote be an activist at work, like especially around like censorship, like how much of this has to do with just like we aren't given the money to actually put the labor towards this problem the way it deserves.
Mhm.
It's not, you don't have the institutional power to do this on your own. And so if we're not doing this at a high level, it's really maybe wasting a lot of labor to try and do it locally because of the nature of copy cataloging and authority control. So I don't know. I just wanted to run that past you two and see if you had any thoughts.
I mentioned earlier that I started out my career as a copy cataloger while I was finishing up grad school. And I started out in that time where, cataloging departments used to have a ton of copy catalogers to do this kind of authority control, to do these kind of record updates. And they, started losing these positions through attrition and people retiring. And they started relying more on vendor records that they were getting from their book jobbers. So if we're, going to make this change, who's going to be there to do it? Where cataloging departments, technical services departments are less than half what they were 20 years ago in terms of staffing. So it's a huge labor issue.
And I feel like this has touched on something like in our Discord, especially when the election first happened, we had a lot of people being like, what can I do at work? Right? How can I make sure that my library, that people in my community know that the library is there for them? And I think our broad answer was like, a lot of this is going to have to happen outside of work. Like you're just going to have to start organizing in your community and not just at work. Like I hate to say that, but there's only so much you can be an activist at work sometimes. Like my politics do not align with the politics of my workplace. Like I have to do shit outside of work to like feel like I'm doing something in my community sometimes. Like I can do stuff in my union, right? And I can mitigate at work. But like if I want my library, like what I should be doing is like, well, how can I encourage groups to maybe use the library, or how can I make sure those dialogues are set up? But like sometimes things are going to have to happen outside of the approved realms of the state apparatus,
And maybe that's one of the answers, or one of the solutions, is that for those of us that are kind of, what can we do? How can we feel effective? How can we give in a way that doesn't jeopardize our jobs and our livelihoods? But how can we push back, or what can we do to make things better? And maybe that's it. Maybe it's the volunteerism of pitching in, rolling up your sleeves and doing the work, like volunteering with Homosaurus, or is there an equivalent to Homosaurus for the Native American community? And if there isn't, let's start that up and working with those.
There's several actually.
Oh, good.
Mm-hmm. Mainly coming out of the Pacific Northwest and places like New Zealand.
So rolling up your sleeves and doing that. And the government doesn't control the internet. The state of Florida does not control the internet. So we, that is a space that we can have freedom to push back in, hopefully without retribution, to at least keep the fight going and to at least make some kind of positive progress.
And there's still, I think we still go back to this principle too of self-protection. You can't do everything. You can't be everything to everybody. You have to protect your own interests first and foremost, because you're not going to do any good if you ruin yourself. You have to, again, cliche, but you have to pick your battles. And sometimes you have to sort of mindfully pass your battles upward to people who are able to fight them for you. There are certainly battles that I wouldn't fight, but I might encourage, higher leadership levels to fight them on my behalf because they're in a position where they can do that. It's a sad reality, but I can't be at the front lines of everything. I can't.
And we talked about this in the virtual book talks last week that Litwin and Library Juice Press hosted. Those of us that are living in kind of red states, southern states, conservative states, we don't necessarily have the same freedom of action. So, those of us who live in blue states or who are in secure positions, may have to fight the battle for us for a time.
And I will say that those of us in blue states have a lot to learn from our comrades in the red states as far as how do you do labor organizing in states which are hostile towards labor organizing. Because, it is not illegal to be unionized in those states, but that is the propaganda that it is. Just because you can't do collective bargaining agreements a lot of the time, but that doesn't mean you can't unionize. It doesn't mean you don't have protections. And as, who knows what's going to happen to the NLRB and everything, but, the power of your union doesn't come from the NLRB, The only reason we have an NLRB is because we're well, I guess we'll stop, shooting the boss in the middle of the night, I guess. That's why we have that shit now. So I don't know. But there's do you think the teachers in West Virginia who went on strike, had legal protections to do that? Absolutely not. Did a single one of them get fired afterwards? No. Because they had built enough power to be able to do that. So yeah, we in the North, there's so many people who are oh, the NLRB. It's I don't give a fuck about the NLRB. That's not what gives my union power. And we have a lot to learn from our comrades in the South.
I was surprised that when I came here that the state university system of Florida has a union, the United Faculty of Florida. And I immediately, I was such an easy sell on joining the union when I got here. One of my colleagues was kind of starting to give me the pitch, and I was like, "Where do I sign up?" I'm ready, and I'm on the union's bargaining team with the administration.
Let's fucking go. Yeah.
I tell you, it's not that far in the past that there was union activism in the South. So if people would just kind of reach back to, the days of their parents, their grandparents, and for the younger generation, their great grandparents, the labor was strong once upon a time, and it can be again.
Yeah, my grandpa was a coal miner, and he took me to United Mine Workers of America, union picnics when I was a kid, and I was reared on stories of slashing scab tires and all sorts of shit. People used to go hardcore. Let's slash scab tires again. It's a good pastime. Teach it to your kids. It'll be great.
And as the U.S. South is looked to as sort of an internal frontier, instead of having maquiladoras in northern Mexico, people are moving things to Kentucky because, they won't unionize. Yeah, they will. They have that memory. They have their coworkers in other states to look to. So the South is primed for a large labor movement. I just got a phone call while we were recording from the Industrial Union for State Workers of Texas, saying that they're heading up to Austin soon. So yeah, it's not impossible. It might work a little different and things like that. But I want to move on to talking about the advice that you both gave in the toolkit. Given the changes that have happened since the book has come out, is there anything that you would change about that toolkit?
I think that we kind of priced in the precarity, the sort of deliberate precarity that people are feeling at this point. That's changed a little bit. In November before the election, people probably felt their jobs were significantly more secure than they do now. But I think we have sort of acknowledged that there's a real feeling of risk to fighting some of these battles. And again, choose your battles, work with other people, collaborate with other people, including your community, including people who have fought these battles before, to be able to do this more effectively.
I think organizing with the community,
Yeah.
I think that's something that I would really play up more, building that support in the community. Hell, I'd probably devote an entire chapter to that now, particularly seeing instances like what happened in Fairhope. The fundamentals are there, though, regardless of we went from bad to worse, but I think the fundamentals are there to scale up. And Jordan and I, when we were kind of preparing for this, we had a conversation. I'm going to pull that up because I had it flagged, where we were talking about what would we do in volume 2 of this, in the next book, if and maybe we'll write that, Jordan. Let's put that in the hopper. We're already working on our next book project. But one thing that Jordan had mentioned is scaling up from the idea of individual self-preservation to institutional self-preservation. So that's something that I think we would definitely kind of pivot and also address.
Could you expand on what you mean by scaling up to institutional preservation?
I think we're at a point where libraries, as this collective entity, which sounds weird to say because libraries are made of people, right? But if we can sort of conceptualize libraries as being this collective thing, I think libraries do feel like there's this sort of existential threat. Is funding going to demolish their entire ability to carry out their mission? To what degree are libraries still going to be, even in, a couple of years, to what degree are libraries still going to be, what they are now? And how can libraries, leveraging the individuals within, how do we fight against that? You want to be able to, keep yourself safe. You want to, keep your interests safe as a person. But if you can reach some, Maslow's baseline of having done that, where do you go from there to keep your library the active, vital thing that hopefully it's always been,
It's not just the librarian advocates with targets on their backs now, but I think libraries as a whole, with the elimination of the IMLS, potentially, the effects of that are going to be devastating. And the work that it was doing, what it was funding, that's going to be devastating, especially for small communities. Is the next step going to be that we're going to be issued, an approved book list by some organization? And if books aren't on this list, they got to go.
Okay, so there's legislation right now in Arkansas about that. It's effectively trying to do away with the Arkansas State Library and put the control of the state library under the Department of Education. And this would basically allow community standards and what the mechanisms funding libraries would be entirely dictated by, if there's, adult content in libraries, which we all know what adult content means, they would lose funding. And I mean, that alone is an existential threat to libraries. And before 2024, before the 2024 election, what was the worst thing that an individual librarian could be called? A groomer, right? But now you have people thinking that libraries themselves are doing the grooming. Libraries, not just, some, bad individual within the library, but the entire institution of the library itself is doing this. How do you fight against that? I don't have the answer to that question. I wish I did.
And then another point that had come up was looking at Dear Emily Drabinski and kind of what happened to her during her term as president of ALA. And she talks about this in her foreword. Audience at home, if you read nothing else in the book, read her foreword, because I think that's really the threat that we're facing is, ALA itself did not stand behind our president. She was muzzled, she was censored, she was put to quarters. Hell, they practically tried to shove her back in the closet. And Jordan had had put this in our text thread, this tension between I've done nothing wrong and I shouldn't have done this. And it circles back to that quote from earlier that a good librarian doesn't jeopardize his library. And so are our actions as librarians, are they causing harm to our libraries? Is the actions of, Dear Emily Drabinski, which has unfortunately cast a pall on ALA, how long a shadow is that going to cast over libraries in this country?
And I think we have something in our building and defending chapter where we essentially try to reframe the cliche about a good library has something in it to offend everybody, to a good library represents its entire community. It's not about offending people. It's about making sure that everybody feels represented and welcome.
Yeah, and I was just going to say it has been this podcast position since that all happened that it is cool and great that Emily is a Marxist and a lesbian, and she should be loud and proud about both of those things. And no one should have been going, no, she's fine to be president. Like, no, it's cool that she's both of those things. And I feel like we didn't see enough people in this profession stand behind her and say, no, it's cool that she is both of those things. It is okay that she is both of those things at the same time, and that she is open about that.
We voted
Emily's
her
been
in
on this
because we wanted her to be these things.
Yes, she was, I believe she was the only candidate for president that we've ever had on because we generally don't care about ALA shit. But like, I wouldn't be the librarian I am today without Emily Drabinski. Like, I cite Queer in the Catalog in everything I fucking do. Like, she's like my hero. I love her. And like, it was the coolest shit in the world when she was on here. And yeah, like, it was so shocking to me that more people were doing the, no, it's okay. Like, she's fine. She's not a groomer. Like, it's fine. We're not socialists. We're not communists. And instead of standing behind what she said and saying it's okay that she's those things, like, it was bad of our profession to not stand behind her.
And I think that more generally, when because a theme that runs through the book is, again, this disgust towards queer people is the driving force of all of these other things in the culture. As far, they might try to defund your local power plant co-op because they have a DEI statement. I mean, this is a really, I'm a wobbly. I'm always going to go back to industrial unionism. Why not have, a conversation with all the other public service workers who are under threat? Just because the library is an information source doesn't mean you can't work with the water department and say, we're a community. What we're doing is important. These are attacks on our community. Because there's definitely going to be that with like your forestry service or anything else that's going to have like a clean environment. It's going to be, a target. Make friends. But yeah, the thing has always been, it's cool. Like, gay people are cool was kind of what we were saying at the time. Is that should be the response to saying there's gay stuff in your library, is saying, yeah, gay people are cool.
We fucking rock.
Yeah.
I am trying to recruit. No.
Yeah.
You're right.
Could be one of the, is one of the ongoing threads of this podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Gay people.
It's like, no, I am a crazy pervert. You're right about that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's okay.
So we've gone a little long, but I think we covered everything we wanted to. So I'm really glad that you both stuck around. Jason and Jordan, is there anything else you would like to share? Things people can look for? Anywhere they can follow you?
Don't follow me.
Okay.
I'm okay with
I'm salty.
Leave him alone.
I post pictures of cats on my social media, usually my cats. I'm so checked out of social media these days. I've really just since November, I've checked out of every fucking thing and have just focused on the work because that's hard. That's tough enough right now. I'll say that Jordan and I alluded to this earlier, but we're already deep in our next project. Maybe y'all will bring us back for that. We are co-editing a 2-volume book about the role and place that J.K. Rowling and the Harry Potter Wizarding World has post 2020, and her whole unmasking as just a terrifying, terrible bigot.
Nice.
The Queen of Turf Island.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll have you back on to talk about that.
This project, we finished the censorship book and we're excited that's going on, but like my mind is like exploding every day when I look at the list of things. Like, so we have like 50 contributions to this Harry Potter book, ranging like all over the spectrum. It's incredible. Like, I'm so excited about this project. Like, the censorship book I'm happy that we did this, but like the Harry Potter one is going to be next level just because it just coalesces so many different, like it's like this prismatic thing about libraries, right? Like, there's, like the well-natured, like liberalism, Harry Potter, childhood literacy and everything, versus what happened in 2020. And like, it feels emblematic of something. And we're editing this book, I think, in part to find out what that is. So there's our little preview of that project.
My chapter would be Ursula Le Guin's right there.
Yes.
Is what my chapter would be.
I think actually I'm co-authoring it. I'm going to do like an annotated bib of, don't do Harry Potter. Look at these as alternatives.
Good.
Yeah, it really always was weird when other people in the library were like, "We're gonna have a Harry Potter themed extended hours for finals," and it's like, do you not Google anything about this person? Like, what's going on here? Like, I get that everyone's age regressing, but come on, man, read another book.
It's like terrible people can make good art. Harry Potter's is also not good art, though. So-
Yeah, J.K. Rowling is not one of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're co-editing this book with another former colleague of mine, current colleague of Jordan's, and we have like this group chat, and they both recently tackled reading Harry Potter, Jordan, for the first time, and just like his commentary through that journey.
It was fucking awful.
Yeah, he couldn't even finish.
You
Like,
saint.
yeah, he couldn't even finish. I've read them several times, so like before the whole turfism. So I did try to reread it in preparation for this, and I just couldn't. I couldn't get back into it.
Hmm.
All right. Well, thank you both
I want
so
to
much.
thank y'all so much.
Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for coming on.
I was looking at y'all's previous podcast and like just really flipping out when I saw some of the ones that y'all have done, like the Leather Archives,
Mhm.
and then interviewing one of the hosts of Bad Gays. Like that is my go-to podcast when I'm doing road trips. So I like Jordan and I, we were just spinning at the thought of doing this. So thank you.
I saw that you guys did an episode about Kiarostami's Close Up, and I am like the world's biggest Kiarostami fan, so I was like, I'm going to
Let's
do
fucking
that
go.
tomorrow morning.
Half of this podcast is like, hey, we don't have an episode. Jay, which weird art house film can you try to force into a podcast context? I'm like, I got Close Up. Let's
My
go.
husband will not let me watch Certified Copy anymore because he's so sick of me watching that movie.
Oh, Jordan's partner, he is so long suffering because Jordan and his esoteric taste in films, it's hilarious.
Incredible.
The Criterion Closet Boyfriend.
Yeah.
What was that
And the
thing you said?
Criterion Boyfriend.
Is it
Yeah, it was Criterion movie boyfriend. It was like
Yeah.
an Instagram reel of some chick being like, I'm dating a Criterion guy. So you watch F for Fake, and I was like, I make people watch F for Fake.
But Jay has good
Anywho,
taste in
y'all-
movies, so it's fine.
That's true. Y'all are both lovely.
Thank
Please
you.
come
Yeah.
on again to yell about Harry Potter, and that'll be great. Or just
will.
any other thing. Y'all are great.
Yeah.
This was great. I really enjoyed this, and keep up the good work. I've really enjoyed this experience.
Always happy to hear that. Good night.